Imagine a new executive order signed with the stated goal of ending crime and disorder on America's streets. But beneath the surface, it could, well, dramatically reshape daily life for some of the most vulnerable people in society. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really unearthing the profound implications of this new EO. We're drawing heavily from a really crucial article called Autistic in Public, The Rising Risks of Being Misunderstood in America. Our mission here in this deep dive is to understand how this isn't just about policy memos. It's about real, tangible changes to how people navigate public spaces, how they seek help, even how they simply exist. It redefines risk and, frankly, reshapes survival for many.
Yeah, and what's truly striking when you actually look past the official language, the safety and order rhetoric, is how this executive order follows a very familiar, almost predictable pattern. This analysis we're using, it argues pretty forcefully that the EO recasts things like homelessness as a threat, and psychiatric or developmental differences. Those get framed as inherent risks.
So less understanding, more managing.
Exactly. The fundamental shift isn't towards understanding people, it's towards containing them. It effectively reduces complex human lives to problems to be managed by police, by courts, and by this widening net of surveillance.
An architecture of distrust, the article calls it.
That's the phrase, yeah. An architecture of distrust. Think about it. Crucial doors that once protected some level of autonomy, like, say, housing programs without preconditions or harm reduction services, they're being slammed shut.
And replaced with?
Replaced with mandates for compliance, coercion, aid that comes with really heavy strings attached. For instance, this EO explicitly expands something called civil commitment. It ties federal funding directly to the visible removal of people from public spaces. And it even encourages sharing deeply personal health data with law enforcement agencies.
That shift from understanding to containment, I mean, that sounds pretty drastic, but what does this actually mean on the ground for you listening or for someone you might know?
Well, the analysis makes it incredibly clear. For autistic people, and especially those who are also poor or racialized, trans, maybe non-speaking, or living with co-occurring conditions, these aren't just abstract policy shifts you read about.
No, they're real life.
They are concrete, material changes to everyday life. They reshape the actual risks involved in just being in public or even just existing without constantly performing what someone else deems acceptable.
Okay, so that brings us to the core question. Why does this EO hit autistic individuals particularly hard?
Right. The analysis highlights what it calls the knife's edge, that this order really sharpens for autistic people because autistic differences are so often and so profoundly misread, dangerously misread, actually, as threats.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine a meltdown, a moment of just intense internal overwhelm. That gets mistaken for defiance or aggression, or echolalia, repeating words seen as mockery. Wandering, which might be a sensory-seeking behavior for some, gets interpreted as loitering. Even a naturally flat affect can be perceived as malice.
And these misreadings under this new EO, they have bigger consequences.
Much bigger. They become incredibly risky. Because when you lower the thresholds for civil commitment, which is basically involuntary psychiatric hospitalization, and you expand things like assisted outpatient treatment, or AOT.
That's the court-mandated treatment outside a hospital.
Exactly. When you expand those, these everyday misreadings become far more costly. And this is a really critical point because it seems to fly directly in the face of established legal precedent, like the Supreme Court's O'Connor v. Donaldson ruling. Which clearly states you cannot confine a non-dangerous person who can live safely with support. So you add these lowered thresholds to the EO's grant priorities, which now align with the Supreme Court's recent grants pass ruling.
The one allowing camping bans even without shelter.
That's the one. So you put it all together and you're inevitably looking at more encampment sweeps, more citations, more police contact. And for autistic people who are already disproportionately caught in what's often called the streety jail loop, well, each contact just tightens that knot. It narrows their options for help and safety even further.
So it's not just making existing interactions riskier, it's actively, it sounds like, dismantling pathways that actually were working for some people.
Precisely. Effective pathways, things like housing first and harm reduction programs. These are low-barrier approaches. They have solid evidence behind them showing they're being actively removed from the federal policy toolkit.
And replaced with courts and compliance.
Which stands in direct opposition to the Olmstead Principle, a key part of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which emphasizes community integration and self-determination. Instead of building trust, This EO seems to be erecting checkpoints.
And the article you mentioned, it has a personal story that really brings this home, right?
It does. It's incredibly vivid. The author describes a routine trip to the grocery store. And they just imagine, what if they had a meltdown right there in the aisle? They note they're not unhoused, but they are a tall, strong, autistic adult.
Okay.
And they ask if they became overwhelmed enough to go nonverbal, maybe to rock or flap or shout. How quickly would people see that as dangerous? Who would get called? And critically, would anyone there know the difference between a meltdown and aggression? Or would they just see a problem to be removed?
Wow.
And the author concludes really powerfully, I don't know that I could honestly say I'm safe in public on my own.
Yeah, it's a chilling thought that takes this right out of policy papers and into lived reality.
Absolutely. And there's another layer too, isn't there? Something about gendered gates.
Yes, exactly. The analysis points to this issue of gendered gates. With HUD, that's the Department of Housing and Urban Development freezing enforcement of its own equal access rule.
Which protected trans people's access to shelters based on gender identity. Correct. With that rule unenforced, single-sex programs, especially, say, faith-run facilities, can now exclude trans women from shelters with much less oversight.
And for autistic trans people.
It creates barriers not just at the door, but through the whole process of seeking help. Think about the intense scrutiny, the sensory overload from noise and crowds in shelters, the long waits, the unspoken demand to appear safe just to be let in. In a world where, as we've discussed, a misinterpreted movement or tone of voice can mark you as trouble, this AO doesn't just tighten the rules, it redefines the very space where people are even allowed to exist. And for many, that space was already perilously small.
Okay, we've talked about this sort of philosophical shift towards containment and its real-world impacts. Let's maybe drill down into the concrete actions. What does this executive order actually mandate? What's the first, maybe most significant provision we need to understand?
Right at the top, yeah, it supercharges civil commitment. Department of Justice, the DOJ, is specifically directed to seek reversal of any precedents or existing consent decrees that they feel impedes civil commitment.
So actively trying to weaken protections.
Yes. And to help states adopt maximally flexible standards for involuntary commitment and that assisted outpatient treatment, AOT. The target is explicitly stated in people on the streets who are deemed unable to care for themselves.
And the clash with existing law.
It's significant. It runs head-on into that O'Connor v. Donaldson ruling we mentioned. You can't confine a non-dangerous person who can live safely with support. And it also clashes pretty directly with the ADA's Olmstead mandate, which pushes for community integration over institutional segregation. So, yeah, expect serious legal challenges on this front.
Not just encouraging more commitment, but actively trying to dismantle the legal guardrails against it. That feels like a huge step. What else does the EO empower or direct?
Well, following from that, it very clearly ties federal money to crackdowns. Federal agencies have to prioritize grants for jurisdictions that are enforcing bans on things like camping, loitering, public drug use.
So rewarding sweeps and arrests.
Essentially, yes. The DOJ can now specifically fund encampment sweeps. And this fits hand in glove with that Supreme Court ruling from 2024, Grants Pass, which, as we said, greenlit camping bans, even if there's no shelter available.
Okay. And what about efforts to help people dealing with substance use challenges? How does this EO affect those?
It takes a pretty hard line. It actively moves to defund harm reduction and target safe use sites. HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, is explicitly told to stop funding harm reduction programs and to pursue operators of overdose prevention sites, sometimes called supervised consumption sites. What's really crucial to note here, though, is that the evidence base strongly contradicts this approach.
How so?
Research consistently shows that these supervised consumption sites actually reduce overdose deaths significantly, and they generally do not raise crime rates in their surrounding areas. So this is a move that goes directly against established public health data.
So pushing more involuntary treatment on one side while actively suppressing voluntary evidence-based harm reduction on the other. What about housing? We know housing first has been a major strategy.
Yes, and this EO directly targets it. It explicitly moves to dismantle housing first and condition shelter on treatment.
Yeah.
HUD and HHS are told they must end support for housing first models.
Which prioritize getting people housed first, then offering services.
Exactly. Instead, the EO allows, or even requires, making treatment compliance a prerequisite for getting housing assistance. Again, this flies in the face of years of large-scale studies showing housing first reliably improves housing stability and significantly reduces homelessness. It's actively moving away from an approach proven to work.
That does seem to be a pattern here, shifting away from low barrier, evidence-based approaches. What about privacy? You mentioned sharing personal health data earlier.
Yes, that's another major piece. There's a significant expansion of surveillance and information sharing. HUD can now require its grantees, like shelters or outreach programs, to collect health data from people getting homelessness assistance
Okay.
and share it with law enforcement as permitted by law. Now, there are caveats. The UPS and another regulation called 42 CFR Part 2, which gives extra protection to substance use disorder records, still technically limit what can be shared.
Oh.
But it's tricky. Many HUD grantees aren't actually HIPAA-covered entities in the first place, and the legal carve-outs for law enforcement are quite broad. The analysis calls this creation of a chilling environment. It could easily deter vulnerable people from seeking help at all if they fear their information will end up with the police.
Yeah, I can see that. And finally, rounding out these specific actions, what about the impact on programs specifically for women and children?
It definitely signals exclusion from women and children programs for some. HUD is directed to allow single-sex programs. And as we touched on, it has already halted enforcement of its own equal access rule.
The one protecting gender identity access.
Exactly. So for autistic trans people, particularly trans women, this translates pretty directly into more closed doors, fewer safe places to turn. It reinforces those gendered gates we talked about.
Okay, so we've broken down the specific provisions in the EO. Now, how do you see these broad strokes actually rippling out? What are the immediate localized changes we might expect to see? What does this mean for cities and states in the, near term?
Well, we can anticipate several pretty significant near-term impacts. First, at the municipal level, cities and counties. Federal grant priorities. They have a really powerful way of bending local policies pretty quickly.
Money talks.
Money talks, exactly. So expect to see local governments across the country start to align themselves with these priorities. That likely means more encampment sweeps, maybe formalizing camping bans that weren't strictly enforced before, revising shelter rules so that treatment compliance becomes a requirement for entry.
And this will probably be framed positively, right?
Oh, absolutely. These shifts will inevitably be framed using language like partnership, public safety, compassion, enforcement, that kind of thing. But the practical effect will be to make support more conditional and to really narrow the margins for people seeking help.
Okay, what about at the state level?
At the state level, this EO basically gives a big federal thumbs up to trends that were already in motion in some places specifically, expanding civil commitment authority and assisted outpatient treatment. We mentioned California earlier, with its SB 43 broadening the definition of grave disability and its care court system, creating new legal paths into court-ordered treatment.
Right.
This EO supports and likely accelerates those kinds of state efforts. And for autistic people who also have a co-occurring substance use disorder, this is a particularly sharp and potentially dangerous turn. The overlap between misunderstood autistic behaviors and these expanded criteria for intervention makes involuntary commitment or treatment more likely, not less.
And the harm reduction piece.
Yeah, the order essentially greenlights a much more aggressive stance from the Justice Department towards overdose prevention sites and the organizations running them. Those programs that might have had some shaky local protection before, they can now find themselves directly in the DOJ's crosshairs.
Which removes a key point of contact.
Exactly. It removes a critical point of contact where trust, not fear, could have potentially been built with very marginalized communities.
And the data sharing aspect, how does that play out practically?
Well, subtly woven through all this is that significant push on data. HUD programs, local homeless management information systems, or HMIS, they'll likely face pressure to collect more health information and to share it with law enforcement, again, as permitted by law.
Which means consent forms become really important.
Critically important. Privacy notices, consent forms, they'll carry far more weight. And people signing them, often in moments of extreme crisis or distress, might not fully grasp the breadth of access they're granting. For autistic individuals, especially those with prior negative experiences with the criminal legal system or just a general mistrust of state systems, this becomes yet another profound reason to avoid seeking services altogether.
That's a lot of concerning changes potentially coming down the pike. So flipping this around for you, listening, maybe navigating these systems, or if you find yourself potentially impacted by these shifts, what crucial protections still exist? What can you actually do?
That's the vital question, isn't it? And there are still things. First, if you are ever being coerced towards an institutional setting, remember Olmsted VLC, it's still the law.
The ADA case.
Yes, it means you have the right, under ADA Title II, to request community-based alternatives as a reasonable modification. And the really important thing here, put that request in writing. Create a paper trail. It's much harder for systems to ignore documented requests.
Okay, written requests. What else?
If you use any service that has a substance use treatment component, maybe it's a shelter, maybe an outreach program, ask them directly. Is this a 42 CFR Part 2 program?
Why that specific regulation?
Because that designation gives extra strong confidentiality protections for your substance use records. Protections that can basically disappear if you sign a broad, generic redisclosure consent form without fully understanding who might see that information down the line.
Got it. Ask about 42 CFR Part 2. What about shelter access, especially for trans folks?
Yeah, for shelter access, particularly for autistic trans individuals, try to ask providers in advance about their policies on placement by gender identity. Don't wait until you're at the door in crisis if you can help it. And if your local city or county has its own non-discrimination ordinances that include gender identity, carry a copy with you, maybe on your phone.
Even if HUD isn't enforcing its rule.
Even then, some local jurisdictions will still enforce their own stronger protections. Having that local ordinance language readily available can genuinely shift a conversation at the intake desk.
Okay, that's practical. What about interactions out on the street, maybe with law enforcement?
If you're unhoused or frequently navigate public spaces where encounters are likely, consider carrying a small rights card or info card. It can do some talking for you when you might not be able to.
What should be on it?
Something simple. I'm autistic. Maybe list key sensory or communication needs like needing quiet or extra time to process or difficulty with eye contact. Include an emergency contact number and specifically request CIT-trained responders if police are involved. That's Crisis Intervention Team Training.
And mention the ADA.
Yes. Explicitly ask for an ADA accommodation if you need to use, say, a communication device or pre-written scripts. In a high-stress encounter, you might not have the mental bandwidth or verbal ability to explain yourself clearly. The card helps bridge that gap.
Makes sense. And finally, regarding housing.
If you are unhoused or at risk of homelessness, actively seek out any local programs in your area that still practice housing first, even if the federal policy is shifted against it.
They might still exist locally.
They might. And remember, the evidence supporting housing first is overwhelmingly strong, even if current federal policy ignores it. And critically, as the analysis suggests, document every single instance where housing is denied to you or where it's made conditional on treatment you don't want or aren't ready for.
Why document?
Because those records aren't just personal frustrations. They become data points. They build a case. They show a pattern that might need to be challenged legally or through advocacy down the road. Your record keeping could become crucial proof.
That's all incredibly practical, really empowering advice. Let's maybe step back for just a moment, try and look at this from perhaps a broader, more systemic angle. The article uses something called the power threat, meaning framework, or PTMF. How does that framework help us understand this executive order even more deeply?
Yeah, the PTMF lens really sharpens the focus here. Using it, you see this executive order not just as, a collection of policy directives. You see it as a profound statement about what gets defined as a threat, who gets cast as risky, and how the state chooses to respond.
So it's about defining the problem.
Exactly. Homelessness gets framed not as a societal failure requiring housing and support, but as a public menace needing removal. Autistic difference isn't seen as diversity, but as inherent volatility needing management.
Yeah.
Both get folded into this narrative where safety is achieved only through control.
And the tools chosen reflect that.
Absolutely. The tools summoned, police, courts, widespread data collection, they aren't neutral instruments. The PTMF helps us see them as mechanisms for imposing meaning from above, flattening the complex realities of individual lives into neat categories that then justify intervention and control.
So disorder is something to be managed away, not understood.
Precisely. And within this framework, those last remaining pathways that actually centered individual autonomy, things like housing without preconditions, evidence-based harm reduction, they are being actively withdrawn. Why? Because they don't fit the control narrative.
And they're replaced by
measures that demand compliance before basic survival needs are met. It fundamentally recasts care itself. It's no longer about meeting people where they are. It becomes a conditional transaction. The state offers shelter or treatment only if you agree to be reshaped into something legible and acceptable to its systems.
And for autistic people specifically.
Well, for autistic people, whose every public interaction, as we've discussed, can be filtered through this lens of profound misinterpretation, The result is a significant shrinking of both physical space and trust. Institutionalization potentially becomes easier. Surveillance feels more normalized. The assumption of danger becomes more routine, harder to counter.
So the PTMF shifts the question.
Right. The PTMF asks us to shift from what's wrong with you, the question implicit in a lot of these control-based systems, to asking what's happened to you, what does this situation mean to you, and what power dynamics are acting here.
And applied to this EO.
Applied to this EO, the answers through that PTMF lens are pretty stark. What's happening is a consolidation, the doubling down on deeply carceral, control-based responses to human difference and distress. The meaning being imposed is that difference equals disorder. And the power, well, it's unambiguously being concentrated in the hands of those who prefer to manage and contain people, rather than truly meet them with understanding and support.
That is, yeah, a powerful and frankly quite unsettling conclusion to draw from that framework.
As we wrap up this deep dive, thinking back over our conversation, what really stands out to you?
You know, the article we've been leaning on, it emphasizes that these are genuinely frightening times, where policies seem to arrive almost preloaded, not just with their intended effects, but with significant foreseeable collateral harms.
Yeah.
And the author is very clear that for them, the act of simply paying attention to these policies, understanding their real-world impacts and reactions, it isn't just some academic exercise.
No, they called it a survival skill. A survival skill, exactly.
Mhm.
And for those living on what the analysis calls the thin edge of acceptability, paying attention is framed as nothing less than the first act of resistance.
It really makes you consider the profound power that lies in just informed observation, doesn't it? In
Yeah.
dedicated advocacy, how much those things matter in actually trying to shape a more understanding and genuinely inclusive society. Definitely something to keep thinking about in the days ahead.